Welcome to the Patch Less, Protect More webinar today. We're here discussing prioritized vulnerabilities that can actually be exploited. So a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and we'll be sharing the recording to all the registrants. Please feel free to post questions at any time during the webinar. We are going to try to take your questions throughout the session, but if not, we'll certainly make sure there's time at the end for Q&A. And with that, I'm Kimberly Bejan, Director of Product Marketing here at SafeBreach. And our presenters are today, Jimmy Sanders. So Jimmy manages the information security for Netflix DVD. He's also the president of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of Information System Security Association and is a cybersecurity committee advisor for several universities and nonprofits. Jimmy holds numerous security certificates and has been involved in computer technology for over 20 years, with 13 years focused on security. Welcome, Jimmy.
Hey, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. We also have today with us Yota Ben Ezra, is the VP of Product here at SafeBreach. He's leading a team that's keeping SafeBreach on the leading edge of breach and attack simulation, with advanced features like risk-based vulnerability management, which was what we're going to be discussing today. Welcome, Yota.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for joining. Pleasure to be here.
And thank you. And with that, I am going to turn this over to Jimmy to kick off our presentation.
So it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. When SafeBreach asked me to present on what I thought about vulnerabilities, the first thing I thought about was vulnerability madness. The way the vulnerabilities are being disclosed, or the way we've been having to adapt and change to the way vulnerabilities are delivered to us or given to us, and even if they're fixed or not. So as for disclosure, I'm Jimmy Sanders. I'm the president for the San Francisco Bay ISA and the head of security for Netflix DVD. So I always try to have full disclosure that this is presentation. It'll be very brief. It's my opinions. It's not Netflix didn't endorse this, or ISA didn't endorse this, or even SafeBreach. Obviously, SafeBreach did review this, but these are my opinions, and obviously they're subject to change. I work for a movie company, so I figured a movie of general audience live would be most appropriate. So first, we'll talk about table stakes and what I mean by table stakes in terms of vulnerabilities. So first things first, we all want to be secure. It's not, I have never met a security practitioner that did not want to be secure. And we all, want to, we don't want to be next. We don't want to be the company that, oh, we made the front page of the New York Times. No one's ever trying not to do a good job. And the other thing is, we want to do the right thing. We want to, make sure that we don't have vulnerabilities. We want to make sure we patch properly. We want to do these things, but what is the right thing? Is the right thing patching all the time consistently? Is the right thing not patching and just building new systems as fast as possible? In this day and age, the right thing depends. So first, I'll talk about the impact of vulnerabilities. Because you have elevation of privileges, you have information disclosure, and you have denial of services. These are just some of the vulnerabilities that you may already be familiar with. But my question is, who is CVE and how did she get my contact information? I didn't ask for this CVE judgment scale, and I understand why they came out with it. But my main gripe with CVE is it doesn't take into account my environment. What's a level 3 vulnerability on a CVE score, a 3.4 or a 7.6 could be a 10 in my environment based on certain controls. Or a level 10 CVE could actually be not a big deal because I have a firewall that's going to block that attack. It doesn't mean that the vulnerability doesn't exist. It just means that the CVE score or impact of that isn't the same in my environment as it would be in your environment and other people's environment. And so when you get into the argument of, oh, we always patch level 4 vulnerabilities, we always patch level 5 vulnerabilities, what does that even mean in your environment? because it may not be a level 4 or level 5. It may really be a level 2, but one of your vulnerability scanners or a CVE score has rated it at a high scale. And then obviously we have the hype and hysteria that goes around among the vulnerabilities. We've all been exposed in various instances or been affected by WannaCry, Shell Shock, Crypto Locker. Everybody want to talk about ransomware and all of these vulnerabilities. So there's so much hype and hysteria in terms of vulnerabilities that we're always trying to make sure that we're not affected by that. I know that my company and we are always trying to ensure that we keep our customers' priority number one, and therefore our infrastructure, we try to keep it as clean as possible and minimize the vulnerabilities. But how do we actually do that? And then we have the driving forces in terms of vulnerabilities. You have vendors who their job is to provide you with the most vulnerabilities that they can discover. One of the big things is, would you choose a vulnerability vendor that is giving you more vulnerabilities, but they are less applicable to your environment, or a vulnerability management vendor that is giving you less vulnerabilities, but the ones that they do give you are more impactful? And then you have security researchers who, they build websites just on a single vulnerability. If you've ever looked and did the research on like the Heartbleed vulnerability or Crypto Locker and others, they actually have websites that'll explain how they discovered the vulnerability, how you can mitigate the vulnerability. But most of the time when they build a website in the beginning, there's no mitigation yet. And so I always kind of think that's funny. And then you have people like us who are the end customers or consumers of these reports, of these vulnerability items. And there's this union among all of us that we all have driving forces to find vulnerabilities, to fix vulnerabilities, but each one of us has our own stake in it that's slightly different. And then in terms of prioritization, what do we fix first? Do we patch everything? Do we patch nothing? I know of certain experiments that have been done in environments where instead of patching a system, we just build a system every 2 to 3 months with the latest patches. And we replace that old system. That way we don't have to patch anything. We just keep building new systems, no patching. And then what do you patch first? Are you going to patch customer service first? Are you going to patch databases, your internal facing applications, your external facing applications? And then the other big question is, how often are we going to patch? Are we going to patch every 3 months? Are we intentionally trying to piss off our internal developers by making them reboot their machines every week, every 2 weeks? What are we doing? So these are the things that happen in terms of vulnerabilities and prioritization. And then lastly is the big thing that really used to drive me crazy, is how do you actually verify that you fixed what you say you fixed? Because you may have this vulnerability management vendor that you run a scan and it shows that you have this vulnerability. Okay, you work with the team, you remediate the vulnerability, or you think you remediate the vulnerability and you rescan it, but it still shows that this system is not patched properly. And the reason why is because it's doing a banner check instead of actually logging into the system and verifying that the vulnerability is there. Is that the problem of the vulnerability management vendor? Is that a problem with you running your scans? Or why is that a problem at all? Because why isn't the vulnerability management system smart enough to know? And even if you think you patched it, how do you actually know it was patched? Do you have a system to test? And are you actively attacking your systems to see if that fix is really fixed? And then obviously the big thing for me is the time lag in terms of implementation into production. Because you may want to go through QA, you want to go through test, and then you want to go into production, but how long does that actually take? And how long that process takes means the window of opportunity that we're allowing attackers. And do we have mitigation under control? And then the last thing is, are we more secure? Because we can do all the patching under the sun. And if you look and see that, oh, they just found this new 0 day here, there's no patch for a 0 day. So we've done all this patching and we still end up getting hacked. And so for me, it's just, once again, vulnerability management, madness. And It's been great talking with you. I'm Jimmy Sanders, and thank you so much for listening.
Okay, so Jimmy, thanks a lot for those insights. And what I want to do or start with is basically share a few data points that follow through exactly on what you're talking about. And it would be great to hear your thoughts on that as well. And so the vulnerability management race, first data point. So the first data point is around the number of vulnerabilities. So years and years ago, the number of vulnerabilities was really small, and we do see a very steady increase in the overall number of vulnerabilities. So as the awareness of security becomes higher, as there are more researchers out there, as things become more digitized, vulnerabilities, you might have thought that the awareness of security will cause those vulnerabilities to decrease over time, but that's very different picture than reality. Basically, in reality, what we see is that vulnerabilities are increasing all the time. And so the number of vulnerabilities, the sheer number of overall vulnerabilities is in the thousands and thousands per year, which is becoming a huge challenge. And second is around the time to exploit. And so if we look at the overall trend in the number of days between a vulnerability is being disclosed to the time it's being exploited, it becomes shorter over time. And so we see that a high percentage of vulnerabilities are exploited very quickly after a patch was issued. And so basically we have to handle a larger number of vulnerabilities in a shorter time. This is a very worrying trend. It means that something needs to change. And here I want to stop for a second and ask you, Jimmy, if this is something that is resonating with you, and do you see the same thing? What are your thoughts on that? Is this something that you see?
No, I mean, to me, I'm such a big proponent of automation because of that. You have so many issues, you have so many times where we're trying our best to patch, but you know, attackers, they have toolkits that are ready to just start exploiting. And so hopefully, you know, we can come up with better mechanisms to do some form of either automated patching in certain cases, or find out how we're vulnerable before the attack start.
Right. Interesting. Okay, going to the next data point. So on the other hand, basically on our side, basically there is a limit to the amount we can patch, right? I mean, some organizations have better automation, some less, but overall we see that there is a very limited number that organizations are actually patching per month, whether it be because of internal processes, whether it be because lack of automation, or maybe lack of time, or maybe, as Jimmy said before, you know, the lack of desire to disrupt our users and our production services. There is a very limited amount of vulnerabilities that can actually be patched every month. And here I have a quick story. I spoke to one of the CISOs in a very large global bank, and he said that they have this benchmark number of vulnerabilities and a benchmark severity that they don't allow, or this is basically their KPI. They must have, they can't have more than X critical vulnerabilities in the organization at any given time. But what he admitted is that he didn't know where this number come from. It could have come from their ability to patch, but it didn't resonate with anything which is related to the risk of them being attacked. And so what this drives is that organizations are starting to understand, or I think most of the organizations are already understanding, that we need to do something else, and that lies in understanding what actual risk does a vulnerability represent for the organization. And so what we see in this point is that, you know, around 85% of respondents to this survey answered yes to the question of whether they are trying to assess risk of a vulnerability. And so what I want to talk about next a little bit is the different options there, the different models or the different parameters which should be taken into account when you evaluate risk, and basically try to see how breach and attack simulation can help there. And so any thoughts on here, Jimmy, on the necessity in understanding the actual risk around the vulnerability?
To me, that's what you're hitting on is absolutely huge. And this is what I was also alluding to earlier, is that what is a vulnerability in your environment, what's a high critical vulnerability based on your risk score, could be a totally different risk score in another environment. So for you to have a formalized program, or for you to have some way of accurately measuring a risk score, is amazing.
Excellent. And so what I want to look at next is basically, so a bit of a summary of what we're saying. So first of all, the numbers are becoming unmanageable. The time that we have decreases on a per vulnerability basis. There is a limit to how much we can patch, and then that drives the necessity in understanding better what we actually want to patch. And so from here, I want to go into different models of what are the things we want to look at when we try to understand the risk around the vulnerability, and how this drives the overall vulnerability management process. And so looking at a very nice slide from Gartner, which counts sort of the things that should be considered. So 4 categories, 2 around the asset that is actually involved, and 2 around the context of the vulnerability itself. And so I'll go through one by one. First of all, what is the exposure to different assets in the organization? And what does it mean? It could mean different things, but basically, what are the vulnerable assets, or even more, what could be the impact for the vulnerable assets, and how do I understand that? And then how do those assets correlate to the business? How do they impact? What happens if this vulnerability is being exploited on a specific asset? How does that impact the business, or how critical it is to the business? Then on the vulnerability side, basically, first of all, the severity of the vulnerability, so the potential impact of the vulnerability, and then a threat context. And the threat context is around what is the likelihood that my organization will be targeted with that vulnerability. That is what is the threat context which gives me. So how many attackers are using these vulnerabilities? How many attackers are using this vulnerability against my vertical? How many attackers are using this vulnerability against my geography? And so on, provides a context which might prioritize a vulnerability over another in terms of likelihood to target me as an organization. And this drives the vulnerability management process. So in a very schematic way, it's a process that goes on and on in a certain period of time, where we scan for vulnerabilities, we assess, and then we prioritize vulnerabilities. And the basic processes these days are basically based on the severity of the vulnerability and the systems that are impacted. Now, each of those can be associated with different levels of detail, with different levels of context. So severity of the vulnerability can be based on a CVSS or a CVE, or it can be based on other things. And this is partly what we can talk about today. And then the impacted systems also, how they are impacted or how they may be impacted is also an aspect to look at. And then compensation by patching is the sort of go-to for preventing vulnerabilities. And the question is it the only go-to? Some of the organizations have already gone to the next level, basically looking at associated threats to a vulnerability using different types of either threat intelligence solutions or specific vulnerability prioritization solutions, in order to basically generate that threat context into the vulnerability and merge that into the prioritization flow. And so if we look at an overall risk-based vulnerability management model, we're looking at 3 major things. First of all, what is the threat? We talked about that. Normally, the source of that would be threat intelligence, and that will give us the intent and the capability of a specific attacker under a specific likelihood, under a specific time, to target a vulnerability. On top of that, we have the vulnerability itself, and the vulnerability can be composed of different things. Most of the organizations today address only the software vulnerability, and we think that this is a problem. We think that basically, if you're only addressing the sheer impact of a specific vulnerability, it provides you a local view of what this vulnerability means. The notion of the security controls involved and your entire network architecture and security architecture is basically missing in that picture. And then lastly, the consequence and the business risk. And so the typical process will involve understanding which assets will be impacted or vulnerable to a specific vulnerability, and basically try to understand the criticality of each of those assets. And the question is whether it's enough. So one example is that I might have a vulnerability on a non-critical asset, but this non-critical asset can attack a critical asset to the organization. So a production server or a database which has customer data, for example. So the customer data database is not vulnerable to the vulnerability, but something which can access it, like a DevOps machine or a developer machine, which is actually pushing something or code into that environment, and that allows him to attack that asset, is something which is not taken into control today. And basically, the next thing I want to show is how those two aspects, the aspect of the actual vulnerability, is something actually exploitable in my environment, and the aspect of the consequence. So what's the consequence of a vulnerability, or what's the potential consequence of a vulnerability being exploited in the environment, are two things which can be extended to provide a more accurate picture of the priority of a vulnerability. And the nice thing about it can all be automated.
Now you're talking my language when you start talking automated.
Okay, yeah. So before I go into the actual vulnerability management piece, I want to introduce a little bit about breach and attack simulation for the people that are with us and are less familiar with the space. I promise only a few slides, and that will help in driving the understanding on how breach and attack simulation can help here. And so breach and attack simulation is primarily focused in validating security controls, and it works by simply taking the attacker perspective. And so the way several stages, so you automatically simulate various techniques, tactics, procedures of attackers, and that helps you understand how an attacker will be able or will not be able to attack your organization. Then you have various visualization tools to understand the different levels of exposure, and additional tools to understand and prioritize vulnerabilities which are actually exploitable. I will go into the details of how this works in a few slides. And then also various tools to holistically remediate and basically update configurations and improve security posture using the security controls that are already there. And so each of those stages a little bit more. And so simulating the attacks safely and continuously, it can be done using our smart automation. It can be basically done in a very automated way. And you can tell our platform, run everything that you have at us, or you can focus on specific use cases of interest, like a specific threat or a specific threat actor, like different tactics and techniques, like specific malware types that you're interested in. You can even build your own custom attacks into the platform, and of course cover a wide range of key security surfaces and security controls in the enterprise across network, endpoint, email, web, and several others as well, which basically allow to get a complete picture of the complete kill chain of how an attacker will see the organization from the attacker perspective. Then the ability to visualize the posture. So various tools from heat mapping against the MITRE attack framework, through scoring your risk in various risk indicators, looking at an explorer view of how an attacker will be able to reach a critical asset or a specific goal in the organization, and then various ways to package the data in executive reports. Obviously, security control integrations, as we are looking to help improve the configuration of security controls and basically get more of what you already have deployed in the organizations, we integrate with a wide variety of security controls. And this integration is about pulling the events which are generated as a result of attack simulations and understanding how the security infrastructure responds to attacks being performed in the network. We can then summarize those. We can actually pull the events and basically save the effort of trying to search for them in different places, but basically gain a very quick and automated understanding of what was missed, what was detected, and what was prevented by the security infrastructure in place. Then on the other side of things, our primary goal in the end is to basically help organizations improve their security posture. And so we have several capabilities to help drive insights on top of the results of the simulation, which relate to remediation actions that can be performed. And those in turn can be automated and can integrate into various platforms which drive remediation workflows. And so from SOAR platforms, which basically automate the end-to-end process, including re-triggering SafeBreach in order to validate that the remediation was actually successful, through SIEM platforms, which are many times used as the operational tool, through the workflow platforms that will trigger different workflows. And those workflows are around either getting more information, approving a change, or suggesting or actually implementing a configuration change in order to prevent the attacks that were successful. So we have reached a vulnerability management integration. And so the way we can help in prioritizing vulnerabilities is basically integrating with vulnerability management tools. And the vulnerability management tools will typically scan vulnerabilities. We will fetch those vulnerabilities from the vulnerability management tools and basically augment that data and correlate it to attack simulations performed in the network to generate a prioritized list of vulnerabilities based on various scores for the risk of that vulnerability to the organization, or for the risk of that vulnerability to be exploitable in the organization. And so a quick overview of those scores. An overall attack surface score, which basically tells you the exploitability or the likelihood of vulnerability to be exploited, the likelihood of a vulnerability to be exploited from outside the organization, then the exposure that the vulnerability will generate. So if this vulnerability is exploited, what is the exposure that the attacker is getting? So how many other assets or how many other points in the organization can the attacker reach by exploiting this vulnerability? And then a couple of scores regarding the critical segments. So if you define something as a critical service or a critical data asset, there are 2 points there. First of all, how many critical assets are exposed, but also how many critical assets are accessible. And so if I have this vulnerability exploited, does the attacker gain the capability to access critical assets in the organization? So what is the outcome? The outcome is that if today we have scan results of several vulnerabilities in the network, and we want to look at the picture and basically target the vulnerabilities with more risk, we are actually getting a much bigger picture. We are getting a very large number of vulnerabilities in the organization and very large numbers of critical and high vulnerabilities in the organization. And so once we add a attack simulation into the mix, we can start understanding basically what are the actual exploitability and the actual risk of those vulnerabilities to the organization. So a vulnerability that might have been critical before, maybe we don't need to patch it tomorrow morning, maybe we can wait, maybe another which is actually more exploitable and more accessible should be patched before that. And so how does it fit into the process of vulnerability management? And so in the assessment phase, you simulate attacks, you can drive improving security, infrastructure security controls configuration out of that, but you can also drive value towards prioritizing vulnerabilities. What are we getting? So if we had the vulnerability severity, the systems impacted, and the threats, now we are adding the exploitability, the exposure in the organization, and the impact on critical systems. And that can very easily be incorporated into the existing model. On the compensation side, we don't actually have to patch everything because we also have compensating control. So if I have an IPS in front of an asset and the vulnerability is blocked by that IPS, there is no reason to patch it before the vulnerability, another vulnerability which can actually be exploited. And maybe it's easier to implement some of the protections in a security control rather than actually patching the systems, at least temporarily. So going back to our model of and summarizing in this, and then I'll go to a quick demo of the platform and the vulnerability management, how it looks like. And so going back to our model, basically we are looking at threat, vulnerability, and consequence. And in this model, we are basically moving from the local target weakness to the actually exploitable target weakness, and from the local consequence to the potential consequence in an organization perspective. So the notion of the ability to access a critical asset given a vulnerability gives us a wider scope of understanding in terms of what would be the consequence of something. So time for demo. So quickly moving to our platform, I will log in here. I will do a quick overview of the platform itself, and very quick. Of course, we are happy if you're interested to get a deeper demo. We are happy to engage on that. And then I will go to the vulnerability prioritization part and talk a little bit about the prioritization. And so when you enter the platform, obviously I've already performed the simulations here. I have thousands and thousands of simulations going on, all automated, and I'm getting a view of how risk is distributed across my organization. I have my overall risk score, and I can basically slice and dice the risk and see which items or which segments in my network are contributing the most to a specific use case that I'm looking at. And so if I want to look at MITRE risk across host level, or if I want to look at my overall critical segments, and I want to understand better on what are the contributors to each of those parts, I can do that using the map here. And then maybe I want to focus on a specific area which is critical to the organization. I can go and explore that area. And so here I can see in more detail how an external attacker might be able to reach my PCI segment. This is where I store my customer credit card data. And I can see they cannot reach the PCI segment directly. I have good controls on the access from the internet for the PCI segment, but 3 hops will get them there. And I can see also the number of attacks or the number of simulations which were successful in each of those steps. And so I see there are much less steps in the last leg here, so I might want to focus here and close that in order to break this chain. I can also get a view of exfiltration and how it looks like in that aspect. So trying to exfiltrate credit card data from my PCI segment, I wasn't successful directly to the internet, but I was successful doing a few hops in the network. And here I have about 170 or 180 ways to exfiltrate that last step. And so if I wanted to analyze exactly what happened here, I could go here, click in here and see all the 178 simulations, but I can also go to that light bulb here and get it packaged in a single insight, which will give me all the data that I need in order to remediate this problem. If I want to go even higher and understand on an overall perspective of the organization how insights look like, I can basically see that I have insights. They are They are sorted by security controls, and they can be filtered by security controls, and they all represent a large number of attacks, and packaged with the different data points that help me basically remediate those. Now I could, if I want to investigate further and I want to understand further what happened in each of those simulations, I can go all the way down and basically see on each simulation what was missed, what was detected, and what was prevented. And so I'll get all the details, all the parameters, the classifications to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and if there were security events associated with that, they will wait for me here as a result of our integrations. I can also look at that from a heat map perspective and see a heat map of MITRE ATT&CK and see how risk is distributed across the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And I can also start playing around with a dynamic map. So say I want to look at a specific threat like an APT29, I can look at the kill chain of APT29 from that MITRE perspective. And so very flexible and very easy to use and also simulate. Very simple way to simulate attacks. And now let's go to the issue of the day. So vulnerability management prioritization. So here is an integration with Qualys. We also integrate with other vulnerability management vendors. And as you see here, we automatically generate a prioritized list, which is based on a combination of those scores. Now, this combination of scores can be customized. And so if, for example, there are a few presets and you can also customize yourself. And so, for example, if I want to focus on my critical segments, I will filter here and I'll get a different priority level based on the access and the exposure to critical segments. If I want to focus on things which are externally accessible and I want to make sure that my perimeter is solid, then I can focus on that. And of course, it's very easy to play around with the prioritization and reach a point where I can basically focus on something which is interesting to me. There is also very rich filtering capability, so I can decide I want to look at only a certain CVSS level, or I can decide this is the vulnerability severity that is coming from the vulnerability management vendor. It might already have threat intelligence incorporated into that, if that is what the vendor is reporting, or it may not. But I can say I want to focus only on a critical and high, for example, from the severity perspective. And so it's very flexible in terms of understanding and customizing the priority to the workflow that I want to build for the organization. Of course, I can also look at different parts of the environment and different types of services. For each of those vulnerabilities, I will get the overall scores in terms of the 5 scores that I explained before, and I will get a detail on a per segment basis how those scores distribute. And then I can also have the direct references here and the CVSS scores, and I can also link directly to view this in the vulnerability management. Now, of course, this can also be downloaded very easily as a CSV or consumed via our API in order to basically incorporate this into any existing system which you use to prioritize vulnerabilities. So I think I am right on time for questions. I would like to thank everyone for joining today, and thanks for your time. It was a pleasure talking about what we do. We're really excited about this capability. And Kimberly, back to you to take questions if there are any.
Excellent. Thank you, Yotam, and thank you, Jimmy. Great presentation. Very insightful. We did get a couple in. This is a great time if anybody does have any questions to post in here. We'll go through the few that we've had so far. So we did one of the first questions, will these slides and all be available? Yes, this is a recorded session. We'll make sure that everyone who's attended gets the recorded link and the content that went along with it. So thank you for that first question. Others that have come in so far, what vulnerability vendors do you integrate with? Yotam, that's a good question for you.
Yeah, so top 3, Tenable, Rapid7, Qualys are all already available. I will mention here that any other vendors are easy for us to add because we have a flexible integrations infrastructure, which means that the logic is the same for all of the vendors. And adding a new one means just adding a connector to their API. So if there are requests on that, and if there are interests on that, we're happy to discuss.
Excellent. Another question we have, Jimmy, this one is going to be for you. It says, which do you prefer, vulnerability solutions that present more or less vulnerabilities?
I actually want less vulnerabilities, but more impactful. I don't need a lot of noise. I get a lot of emails and a lot of alerts from systems that just want to notify me about stuff that really doesn't matter. I don't care about informational vulnerabilities, or I get all these reports that give me informational things. I need actionable things and not informational things. So less alerts and less noise, but more impactful.
Good. Excellent. Let me see. We have another one here. Jimmy, I think this one's going to be for you as well. What are your key takeaways from running a vulnerability management program?
Key takeaways is it can be a culture killer if you do it wrong, because you will make everybody mad at you. But it could also be a job killer if you don't find a way to balance the need to patch and prioritize with the need of ensuring that your business is working properly. And so for me, one of the big things about that I've had to do was try to be as transparent as possible with my employees about the vulnerabilities that we have. And what I mean by that is that just because Qualys or Rapid7 or whatever vendor you're using is telling you that it's a level 7, you have to show over time why that is actually a real vulnerability that should be patched instead of just another piece of noise. Because at the end of the day, developers, they just want to code. They don't want to be rebooting their systems and doing things like that. And the more they complain, the more they'll start complaining to their managers and executive staff. So just understanding the politics and the culture of patch management.
Which leads exactly to the storyline of the madness you're trying to identify, just more layers of that for sure.
Yes, ma'am.
And then we have another question here. Does the integration provide the ability to flag vulnerabilities based on simulations the organization has not chosen to patch?
Yeah, so
yeah, Yota, you want to take that one?
Not today, but the idea is that if you build the right prioritization for you, then those vulnerabilities should be way down in the list, and the vulnerabilities that are important to you should be up on the list. And so the vulnerabilities that are important are what we're trying to identify. It's an interesting idea, though. So basically, the ability to exclude vulnerabilities, definitely something to look at.
Good question. Thank you very much. And then it seems like our last question we have coming in is, are these additional license needed to run these simulators for vulnerability management?
So no, it's included in the capabilities of the product, and our licensing model is very simple, such that there's no additional fees for this capability.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you both so much for your time today. It looks like we have come to the end of our questions. Thank you both so much. Jimmy, very insightful. Always a pleasure having you on for our sessions. And Yotam, always great demo, great material. Thank you everyone for attending today. And with that, we will be closing out our webinar.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure.